After the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Persian Gulf War, the United States was at an all-time geopolitical high in the early 1990s, was also a vast time of optimism and democratic expansion throughout the post-communist world. Especially after the 1989 revolutions in Eastern Europe, authoritarianism was kind of on its global heel at this time period from 1991 to 2015, which is generally considered to be the golden age of democratic expansion. Additionally, the results of the Yugoslav wars were some of the first major international conflicts since the end of the Cold War, and the United States proved itself to rally NATO around various interventions such as Kosovo and to end the war and bring the Serbs to the negotiating table to end the Kosovo War. This video is about the color revolutions, which were a series of non-violent means of regime change and democratization in the post-Soviet states and former Federal Republic of Yugoslavia during the wave of democracy that is often overlooked as it takes place between the very successful 1989 revolutions and the violent and mixed results of the Arab Spring. The various revolutions that took place during the color revolutions were primarily triggered by electoral results that were widely viewed as to have been falsified, mass political and government corruption, human rights violations, and general authoritarianism in the existence of these regimes. The color revolutions were marked by the usage of the internet as a method of communication, as well as a strong role of non-government organizations in the protests and nonviolent resistance in the civil political activism for Western-style democracy. Many were inspired by the Portuguese Carnation Revolution of 1974 and the Czechoslovak Velvet Revolution of 1989 for using colors and flowers as their symbols for democratization. The color revolutions also saw 7 general steps that were very similar in each case. Number 1 being a semi-autocratic rather than fully autocratic regime, 2 being an unpopular incumbent, 3 a united and organized opposition, 4 being an ability to quickly drive home the point that voting results were falsified, 5 being that enough independent media was there to inform citizens about the falsified results, 6 being that a political opposition was capable of mobilizing tens of thousands or more demonstrators to protest electoral fraud, and the final 7th step being that there were divisions among the regime's coercive forces. The first of the color revolutions took place in Serbia after the 2000 Yugoslavian election, where the incumbent Slobodan Milosevic refused to step down after only receiving 38% of the vote, and the opposition candidate received over 50%. The result was the popular overthrow of Milosevic's regime in what became known as the Bulldozer Revolution in October of 2000. That's one of the most memorable episodes from the long day of protesting, saw a heavy equipment operator charge the Radio Television of Serbia building, which was considered to be the symbolic and Milosevic regime's propaganda wing during the Yugoslav wars. The next of the color revolutions was the Georgian Rose Revolution of 2003, which was a non-violent change of power that occurred in Georgia in November of that year. The revolution was brought about by widespread protests over the disputed parliamentary elections and culminated in the resignation of the incumbent President Eduard Shevardnadze, who claimed victory in the election and was quite authoritarian. This marked the end of the Soviet-era leadership in Georgia, and the revolution derives its name from the climatic moment when demonstrators led by Mikhail Saakashvili stormed the parliament session with red roses in hand, and Saakashvili then won the new 2004 presidential elections. The Adjara crisis in 2004 was one of the first major issues that the Saakashvili new government in Georgia had to deal with. It was a political crisis in Georgia's Adjaran Autonomous Republic, and it was led by Aslan Abashid, who refused to obey the central authorities after the previous president had been ousted during the Rose Revolution in November. Things escalated to the point of mobilization of troops on each side, but Saakashvili managed to avoid bloodshed and with the help of the Adjaran opposition reasserted Georgian supremacy over the region. Abashid then left the region into exile in Russia in May of 2004. Next up is probably one of the most well-known in recent years, and it is the 2004 Orange Revolution in Ukraine. This revolution came after the disputed second round of the 2004 Ukrainian presidential election, leading to the annulment of the result and the repeat of the round, which saw opposition leader Viktor Yushchenko declared president, who advocated for closer Western relations, and he defeated Viktor Yanukovych, who was supported by Putin's Russia. Kyrgyzstan witnessed the Tulip Revolution in 2005, which also has been called the Pink Revolution. The Tulip Revolution was more violent than its predecessors and followed the disputed 2005 Kyrgyz parliamentary election. At the same time, it was more fragmented than previous color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine, which meant that there was much more infighting among protesters with what they wanted and what their grievances were. But they were successful at attaining regime change against the corrupt and authoritarian government. The protesters in different areas also adopted the colors pink and yellow of their protests to be like the orange and rose revolutions. The first unsuccessful revolution was the 2006 Jeans Revolution in Belarus, which has also been named as the Denim or Cornflower Revolution. The term Jeans Revolution comes from the Soviet era, where wearing blue jeans was a symbol of Western culture and Soviet people wore blue jeans as a means of protest. Anyway, Alexander Lukashenko had previously removed term limits in 2004 so that he could remain in power and constantly run again with electoral fraud. And when he won a definitely free and fair election, people demanded that an immediate challenge to the fraudulent election and were immediately repressed by the dictator through the use of force. The Moldova 2009 protests against their authoritarian communist regime were also unsuccessful, as the Moldovan incumbent government was able to repress the protesters and remain in power. With social media playing a massive role in the organization of protests, the internet was cut off in the capital by the government, and President Voronin declared the protesters to be fascists intoxicated with hatred. Voronin's reactions to the protests were subject to mass criticism, as he utilized the secret police, oversaw mass arrests, and sealed the country's borders, as well as censored the media, and led to comparisons between him and Joseph Stalin's methods of communist repression. Additionally, Amnesty International and the BBC reported on numerous cases of torture and ill treatment, as well as brutality towards the protesters in Moldova by the regime. As President George W. Bush was very passionate about spreading democracy, the U.S. role in the color revolutions was of aiding various elements of the protests, but not instigating them. For example, the U.S. government, via the State Department, USAID, Radio Liberty, and Freedom House, provided aid to opposition protests by funding independent print media outlets in countries. When the Kyrgyzstan government utility cut off electricity and the outlets throughout the country, the U.S. Embassy provided emergency generators for the anti-government groups. Furthermore, other opposition groups and opposition TV stations received funding from the United States and other U.S.-based NGOs during the color revolutions. Generally, the transition phase to democracy from non-democracy is considered the most unstable and dangerous time for a country. As it is considered a chaotic and radically revolutionary time, extremist groups may rise up to seize elements of power, corruptions tend to skyrocket, insurgencies can spring up due to instability, and a lot of other problems tend to emerge, which could make it a video of its own. But the point is that due to this general tendency of transitional states, the Bush administration did a really good job at immediately supporting the new governments through the recognition of them and maintaining relatively stability throughout the early 2000s when compared with what normally happens for transitional democracies. Meanwhile, the Russian revisionist viewpoint claims that the color revolutions were a US-based plot and coup to overthrow governments that were friendly to Russia and create pro-Western regimes that are anti-Russian. However, this viewpoint definitely neglects the fact that is pretty much in every post-Soviet country in the world, people wanted westernization in the 90s and 2000s. Additionally, the populations had many grievances against their existing governments, where they wanted a radical change from authoritarian semi-communism, and democracy and westernization was considered that radical change that they wanted. Did you know about the color revolutions before this video, and how democracy spread through post-communist states, as well as how the Bush administration supported states in this transitional period? Of course, there's a whole lot more details to each revolution that I didn't go into, as this was merely a summary video. But would you like videos on each of these particular pieces of the color revolutions and the context in certain cases? Or do you also want a video about the long-term results and effects of the color revolutions? Let me know all of that in the comments below, and thank you for watching.